Hello and welcome to Dreamtime History. Imagine yourself beneath the bustling streets of modern London, far below the rumble of traffic and the glow of neon signs. Here, in the darkness beneath glass towers and concrete pavements, lies another city entirely, a forgotten metropolis that once thrived nearly 2,000 years ago, where Roman merchants traded exotic goods along cobbled streets, where citizens gathered in grand forums, and where the foundations of what we now call London first took root. This is the lost world of Roman Londinium, a city that flourished for centuries before mysteriously fading into silence, leaving behind only fragments buried in the earth. But what really happened to this vanished civilization beneath our feet? How did a thriving Roman provincial capital simply disappear from history? And what secrets do the stones and ruins still whisper to those who know how to listen? Tonight, we descend into the hidden layers of time to uncover the remarkable rise and enigmatic fate of the city that sleeps beneath London. But before we begin our journey, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So, I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. To understand why Londinium came to exist at all, we must first travel back in time and stand beside the Thames as it was nearly 2,000 years ago. Picture a river very different from the one that flows through modern London today. This was a Thames wider and more unpredictable, meandering through marshlands and tidal flats, its banks thick with ancient oak and alder, its waters running clearer but more treacherous. The landscape stretched away on either side in rolling hills covered by dense woodland, broken only by scattered clearings where native British tribes had carved out their settlements and farmland. The Romans, when they arrived in Britain in the middle of the 1st century, were above all practical people. They thought in terms of roads and supply lines, of strategic positions and natural advantages. As their legions pushed inland from their initial landing points on the southern coast, they followed the ancient trackways and river valleys that had served the Britons for centuries. But they also looked with fresh eyes, seeing possibilities that the scattered tribal kingdoms had not fully exploited. It was somewhere around the year 47 that Roman engineers and military planners first recognized the extraordinary potential of a particular bend in the Thames. Here, perhaps 30 miles upstream from where the river met the sea, the waterway narrowed significantly. The banks rose higher and firmer than in the marshy stretches downstream, offering solid ground for construction. More importantly, this was the lowest point where the Thames could be reliably crossed on foot, during low tide, and the highest point where larger vessels from the continent could navigate upstream with their cargoes. Stand on the southern bank in your mind's eye where Suffolk lies today, and look north across the dark water. The river here runs perhaps 200 yards wide, shallow enough at low tide that a determined person might wade across, though the currents remain treacherous and the muddy bottom uncertain. On the northern shore, the ground rises in a series of low hills, well drained and defensible, perfect for a permanent settlement. Two small streams flow into the Thames at this point, the Fleet from the northwest and the Walbrook from the north, providing fresh water and natural harbours for smaller vessels. But the Romans saw more than just a convenient crossing point. They envisioned a hub where the great roads of their new province would converge. A bridge built here could carry traffic not only between the northern and southern shores of the Thames, but also serve as the focal point for the entire road network of southern Britain. Roads could radiate outward like spokes of a wheel, connecting this central point to the tribal capitals they were subduing, to the military camps they were establishing, and ultimately to the channel ports that linked Britain with the rest of the empire. The site possessed another crucial advantage that the Roman military mind immediately grasped. The bend in the river created a natural defensive position. Any settlement built on the north bank would be protected by water on two sides, with the Thames curving around it like a protective arm. An enemy approaching from the south would have to cross the river under the eyes of defenders, while attackers from other directions would find their movements channeled and restricted by the marshy ground and tributary streams. The tides here were predictable enough to allow regular navigation, yet strong enough to carry away waste and provide natural flushing for any port facilities. The soil was firm clay and gravel, perfect for supporting substantial buildings, yet not so hard as to make excavation impossible. Ancient gravel terraces provided ready building materials, while the surrounding forests offered seemingly unlimited timber for construction and fuel. Perhaps most importantly, this crossing point already existed in the mental geography of the native Britons. For generations, possibly centuries, tribal traders and travellers had used this ford or built temporary bridges here. The Romans were not imposing their vision on an empty landscape, but rather recognizing and enhancing a location that human activity had already marked as significant. Local knowledge and established trade routes would naturally flow toward any permanent settlement built at this strategic point. The Roman decision to establish what they would call Londinium was not made in a single moment, but evolved through the practical needs of conquest and administration. Initially, they may have built little more than a temporary camp and a wooden bridge to serve their advancing armies. But as the conquest of southern Britain proceeded, and as the need for a central administrative and supply depot became apparent, this modest crossing point began to take on greater importance. The engineers who first surveyed this bend in the Thames could hardly have imagined that they were choosing the site for what would become one of the largest cities in the world. They saw simply a practical solution to the problems of movement and control in a newly conquered province. They needed a place where roads could meet, where supplies could be landed and distributed, where military communications could be coordinated, and where the growing civilian population that followed in the wake of conquest could establish the markets and workshops that would make the new province economically viable. Yet in choosing this particular spot, these practical Roman minds had selected one of the most advantageous urban sites in northern Europe. The Thames crossing that would become Londinium possessed that rare combination of geographical features that allows a settlement not merely to survive, but to prosper and grow far beyond the intentions of its founders. Here, where the river was narrow enough to bridge but deep enough for ships, where the land was firm enough to build upon but rich enough to farm, where forest provided timber and stone could be quarried nearby, the seeds of a great city were about to be planted in the fertile soil of strategic necessity. What began as a simple military crossing and supply depot would, within just a few short decades, transform itself into something far more complex and vibrant. The seeds of commerce, once planted in the fertile soil of strategic necessity, grew with remarkable speed. Word of the new settlement spread along the trade routes and military roads that now converged on this Thames crossing, carried by merchants, soldiers, and the restless tide of people who always follow in the wake of conquest and opportunity. Picture yourself standing on the newly constructed wooden bridge in the early morning mist, perhaps 20 years after the Romans first drove their stakes into the muddy riverbank. The structure beneath your feet is sturdy but simple, built of oak timbers cut from the surrounding forests, and joined with the practical efficiency that marks all Roman engineering. Below you, the Thames flows dark and strong, carrying the scent of salt from the distant sea and the earthy smell of the marshlands upstream. But now the river carries something else as well, the traffic of empire. A barge loaded with amphorae of wine from Gaul nudges against the wooden wharves that have sprung up along the northern shore. Nearby, a smaller vessel unloads bales of wool and hides from the British countryside, while another takes on a cargo of worked metal and pottery that will travel upstream to supply the military camps and civilian settlements spreading across the interior of the province. The air fills with voices speaking not just Latin and the Celtic languages of Britain, but Greek, Germanic dialects, and tongues from the far reaches of the Mediterranean world. The settlement that grew up around this bustling river crossing bore little resemblance to the grand Roman cities of the continent. There was no marble here, no soaring columns or monumental architecture. Instead, Londinium in its early years was a town of wood and clay, of practical structures built quickly to meet immediate needs. Along the muddy streets that led down to the river, wooden buildings housed workshops where craftsmen worked iron into tools and weapons, where potters shaped clay vessels for storage and transport, where bakers fed the growing population with bread made from grain shipped downstream from the agricultural heartlands. The merchants who came to this new market town were a cosmopolitan mix drawn from across the known world. Some were Romans by birth, citizens of the empire who saw opportunity in this distant province and had the capital to invest in trade goods and transport. Others were freedmen, former slaves who had earned or bought their liberty and now sought to build new lives in the fluid social environment of a frontier settlement. Many were Britons themselves, tribal nobility and skilled craftsmen who adapted quickly to the new economic opportunities that Roman rule had brought to their island. These early residents of Londinium lived in a world that would seem both familiar and strange to our modern eyes. The houses that lined the muddy streets were simple structures, most consisting of a single large room with a hearth at the centre, built around frameworks of heavy timber and filled with wattle and daub. The floors were earthen, perhaps scattered with rushes, and the windows were small openings covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth rather than glass. Yet within these humble dwellings, archaeologists have found evidence of surprising prosperity: fine pottery imported from Gaul, jewellery worked in silver and bronze, coins from across the empire, and the remains of foods that speak to a diet far more varied than that of the native British settlements. The rhythm of life in early Londinium was dictated by the tides and seasons, by the arrival and departure of ships, by the endless cycle of buying and selling that forms the heartbeat of any market town. You might wake before dawn to the sound of cartwheels rumbling across the wooden bridge, carrying goods to be loaded onto vessels that would catch the outgoing tide. The morning air would be thick with smoke from cooking fires and workshops, mixed with the scent of fish from the river and the sharper smell of leather being cured in the tanners' yards. As the day progressed, the settlement would come alive with activity. In the marketplace near the river, merchants spread their wares on wooden tables or simple cloth, coverings, bolts of fine wool and linen, bronze mirrors and silver brooches, exotic spices and preserved fruits from the Mediterranean, tools and weapons of iron and steel. The sounds would be those of any busy market, the voices of sellers calling out their prices, the patient argument of buyers seeking a better deal, the splash of oars as boats manoeuvred for position at the crowded wharves, the creak of leather and wood as heavily laden carts made their way through the narrow streets. The taverns and inns that served this transient population were rough establishments, offering simple fare and basic accommodation to traders, soldiers and travellers passing through. Here, over cups of wine or locally brewed ale, news and gossip travelled as surely as goods and currency. A merchant recently arrived from Gaul might bring word of events in Rome itself, while a British chieftain could provide information about conditions in the unconquered lands to the north and west. These informal networks of information and connection were as vital to the town's growth as the formal structures of Roman administration. What made early Londinium remarkable was not its size or grandeur, but its adaptability and energy. This was a settlement that existed purely through the force of economic necessity and opportunity, without the official blessing of imperial planning or the ancient sanctity of tribal tradition. Its population was fluid, its buildings temporary, its very existence dependent on the continued flow of trade and the stability of Roman rule in Britain. Yet within this apparent fragility lay a hidden strength, for Londinium was learning to thrive not through the accidents of birth or conquest, but through the patient application of human ingenuity to the fundamental challenge of bringing buyers and sellers together across vast distances and cultural differences. In these early decades, the town was writing the rules of its own existence, creating through daily practice the customs and relationships that would eventually crystallize into the grand civic structures of later centuries. Yet beneath the bustling commerce and apparent prosperity of this growing settlement lay currents of uncertainty that few of the daily traders and craftsmen would have fully grasped. Londinium existed in a state of delicate balance, poised between two worlds that had not yet learned to trust each other completely. The Roman conquest of Britain was still a recent memory, barely 2 decades old, and the new order remained fragile in ways that would only become clear with the passage of time. The political landscape of early Roman Britain was far more complex and unstable than the confident maps and administrative documents of later centuries might suggest. Beyond the Thames crossing where Londinium thrived, much of the island remained only loosely controlled by Roman authority. The great military campaigns of conquest had subdued the major tribal kingdoms of the south and east, but vast areas of the north and west remained either unconquered or held by treaties that could prove as fragile as morning mist. Even in the supposedly pacified regions around the new settlement, Roman control often extended little beyond the major roads and fortified positions. This uncertainty shaped the character of early Londinium in subtle but profound ways. Unlike the established cities of Gaul or Spain, where Roman rule had been consolidated for generations, this Thames crossing existed in a landscape where loyalties remained divided and the future uncertain. The merchants who built their wooden shops along the muddy streets knew that their prosperity depended not just on the natural advantages of geography and trade routes, but on the continued stability of a political arrangement that many of the native population had accepted reluctantly, if at all. The Roman military presence in and around Londinium during these early decades was significant but not overwhelming. Archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement was protected by auxiliary units, rather than the heavy legionary forces that garrisoned the major military camps along the frontier. These soldiers, many of them recruited from other provinces of the empire rather than from Britain itself, served not only as defenders but as customers, consumers, and participants in the economic life of the growing town. Their presence provided security and purchasing power, but it also served as a constant reminder that Roman rule ultimately rested on force rather than consent. Yet what made Londinium remarkable during this formative period was not the tension between conqueror and conquered, but the gradual emergence of something genuinely new. The settlement attracted people who, for various reasons, found themselves caught between the old world and the new. British craftsmen discovered that Roman techniques could improve their work and expand their markets, while Roman merchants learned that success in this distant province required understanding and accommodating local customs and preferences. The result was a culture that was neither fully Roman nor traditionally British, but something uniquely suited to the circumstances of its time and place. Walk through the settlement in the cool of evening, when the day's trading has ended and the cooking fires send thin streams of smoke into the darkening sky. In one house, you might hear a British family speaking their native language while eating from Roman pottery and wearing clothes fastened with bronze brooches made in continental workshops. Next door, a Roman merchant's household includes British servants who have learned Latin but still honour the gods of their ancestors, alongside the official deities of the empire. Children play in the streets with toys that blend Roman and British traditions, while in the workshops, craftsmen develop techniques that combine the best of both cultures. This blending was not always smooth or harmonious. The imposition of Roman law and taxation created resentments that simmered beneath the surface of daily life. British tribal leaders found their traditional authority challenged by Roman administrators who recognised different concepts of legitimacy and justice. Religious practices that had anchored British communities for centuries were forced to accommodate or compete with the gods and rituals of Rome. The very layout of the settlement, with its Roman-style streets and market squares, implied a different understanding of how communities should be organised and governed. Economic tensions added another layer of complexity to these cultural negotiations. The prosperity that Roman trade brought to Londinium was not distributed equally among its population. Merchants with capital and connections to imperial networks could accumulate wealth with remarkable speed, while traditional British crafts and agricultural practices often found themselves displaced or marginalised by more efficient Roman methods. The monetary economy that the Romans brought to Britain created opportunities for some, but dependence and vulnerability for others who had previously operated within networks of kinship and reciprocal obligation. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the simple fact that no one could predict how long this new arrangement would last. The Roman Empire was vast and powerful, but it was also distant and preoccupied with threats and opportunities in other parts of the world. If political circumstances changed, if military disasters required the withdrawal of troops, if economic priorities shifted, the Roman presence in Britain could prove as temporary as it was transformative. The merchants and craftsmen of Londinium built their businesses and their lives on the assumption of continued Roman rule, but they did so without any guarantee that this assumption would prove correct. This underlying uncertainty gave early Londinium a peculiar energy and adaptability, because nothing could be taken for granted, because the future remained genuinely open. The settlement attracted people who were comfortable with risk and change. These were individuals and families willing to bet their futures on their ability to navigate between different worlds, to profit from cultural and economic transitions, to build something new from the creative tensions between Roman ambition and British reality. They were the kind of people who would later prove capable of surviving disasters that would have destroyed more rigid and traditional communities. In this atmosphere of opportunity and uncertainty, Londinium began to develop the characteristics that would define it throughout its history: pragmatism over ideology, adaptability over tradition, commercial calculation over political or cultural purity. The fragile balance that had allowed Londinium to flourish for nearly 2 decades was shattered in the summer of the year 60, when the simmering tensions between Roman authority and British resistance finally erupted into open rebellion. The catalyst was not some grand political miscalculation or military defeat, but rather the kind of personal injustice that can transform private grievance into public uprising. When the client king Prasutagus of the Iceni died, leaving his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman emperor, imperial officials seized the opportunity to assert direct control over his territory in ways that violated both Roman law and British custom. The brutal treatment of his widow Boudica and the humiliation of his family provided the spark that ignited years of accumulated resentment across the tribes of eastern Britain. Word of the uprising spread with remarkable speed through the networks of kinship and trade that connected the British tribes. What began as a local revolt among the Iceni quickly drew support from the Trinovantes, whose own grievances against Roman rule ran deep, and from other groups who saw an opportunity to reclaim their independence. The rebels moved with a purpose and fury that caught the Roman authorities completely unprepared. Their first target was the new Roman settlement at Camulodunum, where the hated temple of Claudius stood as a symbol of imperial domination and a constant drain on tribal resources through its demands for tribute and sacrifice. The destruction of Camulodunum sent shockwaves through every Roman settlement in Britain, but nowhere were those tremors felt more acutely than in Londinium. The thriving market town had grown precisely because it served Roman interests and facilitated Roman rule. Its merchants, craftsmen, and administrators knew that their prosperity depended entirely on the continuation of imperial control. When news arrived that the rebels had not merely captured Camulodunum, but had systematically destroyed it, burning every building and killing every Roman they could find, the people of Londinium faced the terrible realization that their own survival might depend on forces completely beyond their control. The Roman military response to the initial uprising was both swift and catastrophic. The 9th Legion, marching south from its base in Lincolnshire, walked directly into an ambush that destroyed it as an effective fighting force. With this disaster, the military balance in eastern Britain shifted decisively in favour of the rebels. Londinium, with its small garrison and largely civilian population, lay directly in the path of Boudica's advancing army, now swollen with warriors from across the region and drunk with the confidence that comes from unexpected victory. The evacuation of Londinium was a chaotic and heartbreaking affair. Those residents who possessed the means and connections to flee did so, loading their most precious possessions onto carts and boats in desperate haste. But many others, particularly the British natives who had thrown in their lot with Roman rule, faced an impossible choice between flight into an uncertain exile and remaining to face the judgment of their own people. The Roman officials and military commanders, recognizing that the settlement could not be defended, made the calculated decision to abandon it entirely, withdrawing their forces to positions where they might have some hope of mounting an effective resistance. When Boudica's forces reached Londinium, they found a town already half empty, its streets echoing with the footsteps of the few who had chosen to remain. The rebels showed no mercy to this symbol of Roman economic domination. They set fire to the wooden buildings systematically, ensuring that nothing would remain that could serve the imperial cause. The flames that consumed the shops and houses also destroyed the careful accumulation of goods and wealth that had made Londinium prosperous: amphorae of wine and oil, bales of cloth and leather, tools and weapons, coins and jewellery, the patient work of 20 years reduced to ash in a single day. Yet beneath the thorough destruction lay something more complex than simple revenge. Archaeological evidence suggests that the burning of Londinium was not random violence, but deliberate and methodical elimination. The rebels sought not merely to hurt their enemies, but to erase the very possibility of Roman commercial and administrative life returning to this strategic crossing point. They understood, perhaps better than the Romans themselves, how completely the settlement's existence depended on imperial structures and connections. By destroying not just the buildings but the stored goods, the workshop tools, the records and contracts that enabled commerce, they aimed to make reconstruction so difficult as to be effectively impossible. The fire that consumed Londinium burned for days, visible from miles away as a pillar of smoke that announced to all of eastern Britain that Roman power could be challenged and defeated. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but charred timber, cracked pottery, and a thick layer of ash that would preserve for future archaeologists the precise moment when one vision of Britain's future was violently rejected in favour of another. The site lay empty through the months that followed, avoided by travellers and traders, a blackened scar on the landscape that testified to the fragility of imperial ambitions. But even as the ash cooled and weeds began to grow through the ruins, the strategic advantages that had originally attracted the Romans to this Thames crossing remained unchanged. The river still needed to be bridged, the roads still converged here, and the imperial administration still required a central point for governing the province. When Roman forces finally defeated Boudicca's rebellion and began the slow process of re-establishing control, their attention turned once again to the deserted crossing where Londinium had once thrived. This time, however, they would build not merely a market town, but a true Roman city designed to endure. The men who returned to rebuild Londinium in the years following the rebellion brought with them a vision fundamentally different from that which had guided the settlement's first incarnation. Where the original town had grown organically around the practical needs of commerce and river crossing, the new city would embody the full dignity and authority of Roman civilization. The charred ruins were cleared away systematically, the debris carted off or buried beneath carefully planned foundations, and in their place rose structures that announced to all who saw them that Rome had returned to stay. The centerpiece of this grand reconstruction was a magnificent civic complex that occupied the highest ground overlooking the Thames, positioned to dominate both the river approaches and the network of roads that radiated outward into the British countryside. Here, Roman engineers and architects created something that had never before existed in Britain. A true forum and basilica complex of the kind that formed the heart of every proper Roman city, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The scale of this undertaking reveals the extraordinary confidence and ambition of the imperial administration, for these were not temporary structures built to meet immediate needs, but permanent monuments designed to endure for centuries. Archaeological excavations in our own time have gradually revealed the impressive scope of this civic centre. Beneath the modern streets of the City of London, careful work with trowel and brush has uncovered the massive stone foundations of a basilica that stretched for more than 500 feet along what is now Gracechurch Street. The recent discovery of a particularly well-preserved section during construction work in the year 2025 has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the building's original appearance with remarkable precision. Rising 2 full stories above the forum floor, supported by rows of massive columns imported from quarries hundreds of miles away, this basilica rivaled in size and grandeur the civic buildings of much older and more established Roman cities. Stand in your imagination within this soaring hall on a morning in the late 1st century, perhaps 20 years after the rebuilding began. The air carries the mingled scents of beeswax from the scribes' tablets, incense from the small shrines tucked into alcoves along the walls, and the leather and wool of the crowds that gather here daily to conduct the business of imperial administration. Light streams through high windows, illuminating the geometric patterns of the mosaic floor, and casting long shadows between the columns that march in perfect ranks down the length of the building. This basilica served as much more than merely an impressive architectural statement. Within its walls, the complex machinery of Roman law and administration operated with the measured precision that had allowed a single city to govern an empire stretching across 3 continents. At one end of the Great Hall, elevated on a raised platform, sat the tribunal, where magistrates heard cases and rendered judgments according to the intricate legal codes that Rome had developed over centuries of experience. Here, disputes between merchants were resolved, criminal cases were tried, and the countless minor conflicts that arise in any complex society were adjudicated according to principles that emphasized precedent, evidence, and reasoned argument over personal relationships or traditional authority. The forum that spread out before the basilica entrance provided the stage for the daily drama of civic life in Roman Londinium. This great open square, paved with stone and surrounded by covered colonnades, served simultaneously as marketplace, meeting place, and theatre of public ceremony. On market days, the space filled with merchants displaying their wares on temporary stalls, their voices creating a polyglot chorus as they hawked goods in Latin, Greek, Celtic languages, and the Germanic dialects of the frontier regions. The covered walkways that bordered the square housed permanent shops where craftsmen sold jewellery, pottery, metalwork and textiles, while scribes offered their services to the illiterate and money changers, facilitated commerce between different regions of the empire. But the forum was more than simply a commercial centre. Here, public announcements were made, official proclamations were read aloud, and the rituals of imperial ceremony were enacted for the benefit of the civilian population. When news arrived of military victories on distant frontiers, or when new laws were promulgated by the emperor, or when religious festivals required public celebration, the Forum provided the natural gathering place for the community to participate collectively in the grand narrative of Roman power and civilization. The construction of these monumental civic buildings required an enormous investment of resources and expertise that could only have been justified by the most serious imperial intentions. The stone for the foundations was quarried from sites across southern Britain and transported to Londinium at considerable expense. The columns, carved decorative elements, and specialised building materials came from even greater distances, some imported from quarries in Gaul or even the Mediterranean. The architects and master builders who supervised the construction brought knowledge gained from similar projects across the empire, while the skilled craftsmen who carved the decorative details and laid the intricate mosaic floors represented the highest levels of their respective trades. This investment in permanent civic infrastructure sent a clear message to both the British population and potential future rebels. Rome was not merely occupying Britain, but transforming it into an integral part of the imperial system. The Forum and Basilica of Londinium stood as proof that the empire intended to govern this province not through temporary military occupation, but through the patient construction of institutions that would make Roman rule both effective and eventually indispensable. Now step into the streets of this rebuilt Londinium as an ordinary resident on a typical morning in the late 1st century. The sun has just cleared the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets that radiate outward from the great Forum like spokes from the hub of a wheel. The air carries the mingled aromas of a city coming alive, wood smoke from countless hearths, the yeasty smell of bread baking in the shops near the river, the sharper scents of leather and metalwork from the craftsmen's quarters, and underneath it all the ever-present smell of the Thames, muddy and rich with the promise of tides and distant shores. You make your way down toward the river port, where the day's first barges are already unloading their cargoes at the wooden wharves that line the northern bank. Here, the diversity of Londinium's population becomes immediately apparent. The dock workers hauling amphora after amphora of wine and oil from the boats speak to each other in a mixture of Latin and British Celtic, their conversations punctuated by occasional phrases in Greek or the Germanic dialects of the Rhine frontier. These are men whose fathers might have fought against Rome, but who now earn their living facilitating the very trade networks that bind Britain ever more tightly to the imperial economy. At one wharf, a merchant ship from Gaul is discharging its cargo under the watchful eye of a Roman citizen whose toga marks his elevated status, but whose accent reveals his provincial origins. He checks each item against a wax tablet covered with careful notations, occasionally calling out instructions in fluent British to the native workers who know the river and its moods better than any foreign captain. His assistant, a young freedman whose precise Latin suggests an education purchased with years of slavery, records the customs, payments and taxes that will flow back to Rome, the golden stream of tribute that makes the empire's grand projects possible. Walk deeper into the commercial district, where the morning market is beginning to take shape in the squares and side streets surrounding the Forum. Here, behind wooden stalls and beneath canvas awnings, the true cosmopolitan character of Roman Londinium displays itself in all its complexity. A British woman sells pottery made in her workshop outside the city, the vessels decorated with patterns that blend traditional Celtic spirals with Roman geometric designs. Her neighbour offers jewellery crafted from British silver, but worked in Mediterranean styles, while across the narrow street, a Syrian merchant displays silks and spices brought from trading posts thousands of miles to the east. The languages you hear create a linguistic tapestry that reflects the reach of Roman power and the mobility it enabled. Latin serves as the common tongue of commerce and administration, but British Celtic remains the language of choice for many everyday transactions. You might hear Greek spoken by an educated slave serving as translator for his master's business dealings, or catch fragments of Egyptian demotic from a trader who has somehow found his way to this northern frontier of the civilized world. Germanic tribal languages filter in from the military camps, while Gaulish and Hispanic dialects arrive with merchants who have followed the trade routes across the Channel. The goods on display tell their own story of an economy that has transcended all previous British experience. Amphorae marked with seals from vineyards in southern Gaul stand beside smaller vessels containing olive oil from Spain and North Africa. British wool, renowned throughout the empire for its quality, awaits shipment to workshops in Gaul, where it will be transformed into clothing for Roman citizens living in cities whose names the local shepherds have never heard. Iron tools made from British ore using Roman techniques share space with bronze mirrors manufactured in Gaul, glass vessels from the workshops of the Rhine, and pottery so fine it rivals the best products of Italy itself. But it is in the workshops tucked away in the quieter streets behind the main commercial areas that you can best observe how Roman Londinium has become something genuinely new, neither purely Roman nor traditionally British, but a synthesis that could have emerged only in this particular time and place. In the metalworking shops, British craftsmen who learned their trade in tribal workshops now use Roman techniques to create objects that serve Roman purposes but retain distinctively British decorative elements. The leather workers produce military equipment to Roman specifications while continuing to practice traditional British methods of hide preparation that Roman tanners have learned to respect and adopt. The rhythm of daily life in these workshops follows patterns that would be familiar in any Roman city, yet retains elements that speak to older British traditions. Work begins shortly after dawn and continues until the light begins to fail, but the pace is measured rather than frantic, allowing time for the careful attention to detail that produces goods capable of competing in imperial markets. The master craftsmen who own these workshops are typically Roman citizens, either by birth or through grants of citizenship that reward their skill and loyalty, but their employees include freedmen, native Britons, and slaves drawn from across the known world. In the taverns and eating houses where these workers gather at the end of their day, you can witness the gradual emergence of a distinctly Romano-British culture. The wine served here is imported from Gaul, but it's often mixed with local ale in proportions that reflect British tastes as much as Roman customs. The food combines Mediterranean ingredients like olive oil and imported spices with native British produce in ways that create new flavours and textures. The conversations that flow around these tables blend practical concerns about trade and craft with gossip from across the empire, creating a sense of connection to a wider world that previous generations of Britons could never have imagined. This daily mingling of peoples and cultures was gradually creating something unprecedented in British history, a truly urban civilization that derived its character not from tribal tradition or imperial imposition alone, but from the creative tension between different ways of understanding the world. Yet beneath the bustling commerce and civic grandeur of reconstructed Londinium lay another dimension of urban life that was perhaps even more complex and significant than the visible world of markets and magistrates. This was the realm of the sacred, where the diverse population of the growing city negotiated questions of meaning, identity, and belonging that could not be resolved through law or settled through trade. In the temples, shrines, and household altars scattered throughout Londinium, Romans and Britons, slaves and citizens, soldiers and merchants sought to make sense of their place in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition within living memory. The most remarkable survivor of this spiritual landscape lies buried today beneath the glass towers and concrete pavements of London's financial district, where archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a temple that speaks to the profound religious complexity of Roman Londinium. This is the Mithraeum, a sanctuary dedicated to the mysterious god Mithras, whose worship spread throughout the Roman Empire along the routes of trade and military conquest. The temple was built on the banks of the Walbrook, a stream that flowed through the heart of the city before emptying into the Thames, its waters now channeled through buried conduits beneath the modern streets. The choice of location was far from accidental. Mithras was a god of shadows and hidden knowledge, whose mysteries were celebrated in underground chambers that evoked the primordial cave where, according to myth, he had slain the cosmic bull whose death brought life to the world. The Londinium Mithraeum was constructed partly below ground level, its entrance modest and unmarked, its interior designed to create an atmosphere of otherworldly mystery for the initiates who gathered there to participate in rituals that were never recorded and remain largely unknown to us even today. Step down the stone steps into this hidden sanctuary, imagining the flickering light of oil lamps dancing across the carved relief sculptures that decorated the walls. The air would have been thick with incense, that exotic perfume of frankincense and myrrh that connected this British temple to the trade network spanning the Mediterranean and reaching into the distant lands of Arabia and India. The central aisle between stone benches led toward the altar, where the tauroctony, the sacred image of Mithras slaying the bull, dominated the space with its promise of death transformed into renewal, darkness giving way to light. The worshippers who gathered in this underground chamber represented a cross-section of Londinium's male population, for Mithraism was a religion that excluded women while embracing men from across the social spectrum. Here, a Roman merchant might find himself sharing ritual meals with British craftsmen, Germanic soldiers, and Syrian traders, all bound together by their common initiation into the mysteries of the unconquered sun. The religion offered its adherents something that neither traditional Roman state worship nor British tribal customs could provide: a sense of personal salvation and cosmic significance that transcended the accidents of birth, nationality, or social status. But Mithraism was only one thread in the complex tapestry of religious life in Roman Londinium. Throughout the city, in private houses and public spaces, the residents maintained shrines to gods and goddesses drawn from across the known world. Roman households honoured their traditional lares and penates, the household deities who protected family and property, while British families continued to make offerings to local spirits and ancestral powers whose worship stretched back to times before memory. Syrian merchants brought with them devotion to Eastern deities like Jupiter Dolichinas, while Egyptian traders introduced the mysteries of Isis and Serapis to a northern audience hungry for spiritual experiences that promised more than the formal rituals of official state religion. The genius of Roman religious policy lay not in suppression, but in accommodation. Rather than demanding that conquered peoples abandon their traditional beliefs, Roman administrators encouraged a process of religious syncretism that gradually wove local traditions into the broader tapestry of imperial culture. British gods were identified with Roman counterparts, their names and attributes adjusted to fit Mediterranean patterns while preserving essential elements of their original character. Sulis, the British goddess of the healing springs at Aquae Sulis, became Sulis Minerva, retaining her connection to water and wisdom while acquiring Roman titles and iconography. Similarly, the horned god Cernunnos, lord of animals and fertility, found new expression in Roman artistic forms while maintaining his essential British identity. This religious flexibility served important social and political functions in a city as diverse as Londinium. By allowing different groups to maintain their distinctive spiritual practices while gradually adapting them to Roman forms, the imperial system created space for cultural negotiation and accommodation that might otherwise have led to conflict or resentment. A British merchant conducting business with Syrian traders could invoke gods they both recognized, even if they understood those deities in somewhat different ways. A Germanic auxiliary soldier could find spiritual comfort in shrines that honored both his tribal traditions and his loyalty to Rome. The domestic shrines found in excavated houses throughout Roman Londinium reveal how this religious syncretism played out in the most intimate spaces of daily life. These small altars and sacred corners combined Roman and British elements with a casual creativity that suggests genuine integration rather than superficial imposition. A typical household shrine might include figurines of Roman gods alongside amulets invoking British protective spirits, all arranged around a central altar where the family made daily offerings of wine, bread, and incense. The prayers offered at these domestic altars were spoken in whatever language felt most appropriate to the occasion, creating a multilingual dialogue between human need and divine power that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the city itself. By the closing decades of the 2nd century, the prosperity and strategic importance of Londinium had grown to the point where its security could no longer be entrusted to temporary expedients and makeshift defences. The wooden palisades and earthwork fortifications that had protected the rebuilt settlement in its early years were no longer adequate to safeguard what had become the beating heart of Roman Britain's economy and administration. The decision to encircle the entire city with a permanent stone wall represented far more than a practical response to military necessity. It was a declaration of confidence in Londinium's future and a tangible expression of the city's evolution from frontier trading post to permanent imperial stronghold. The construction of what would become known to later generations as London Wall was an undertaking of almost staggering ambition and complexity. The circuit of fortifications, when completed, would enclose an area of approximately 134 hectares, making Londinium the largest walled city in all of Roman Britain. To appreciate the magnitude of this achievement, imagine the logistical challenges involved in quarrying, transporting, and assembling the thousands of tons of stone required for such a massive project. The primary building material was Kentish ragstone, a durable limestone that had to be extracted from quarries located more than 70 miles away in what is now Kent. The journey of each block of stone from quarry to construction site tells its own story of Roman engineering prowess and organisational capability. The ragstone was first loaded onto barges at quarries near Maidstone, then transported down the River Medway to its confluence with the Thames, and finally carried upstream against the current to the wharves of Londinium. There, teams of oxen and human labourers hauled the massive blocks through the crowded streets to the construction sites where master masons and their assistants shaped and fitted each stone, according to precise specifications that had been developed through centuries of military engineering experience across the empire. The wall that rose from these foundations was a monument to Roman building techniques that had been refined through generations of fortress construction on hostile frontiers. At its base, the structure measured more than 2 meters in thickness, providing a foundation solid enough to support walls that rose more than 6 meters above ground level. The distinctive bands of red tile that were laid at regular intervals throughout the stonework served not merely as decoration, but as crucial structural elements that helped distribute weight and stress evenly throughout the massive construction. These tile courses, made from clay fired in kilns specially established for the project, created the characteristic striped appearance that would mark London Wall as unmistakably Roman for centuries to come. Stand beside the wall on a morning when the construction crews are at work, perhaps in the year 210, when the Great Circuit is nearing completion. The sounds that fill the air speak to the international character of the labour force that Rome has assembled for this monumental task. The rhythmic chanting of work songs in Latin and Celtic, as teams coordinate their efforts to lift massive stones into position. The sharp crack of chisels shaping blocks to fit precisely into predetermined spaces. The creaking of wooden cranes and pulleys as they swing heavy loads up to the walkways, where masons wait to set them in place. The dust raised by all this activity creates a fine haze that catches the morning sunlight, while the scent of mortar mixed with imported lime mingles with the ever-present smell of the Thames and the smoke from the workers' cooking fires. But the London Wall was more than simply a defensive barrier. It was also a powerful symbol of civic identity and imperial belonging. Each gate that provided access through the fortifications was designed as a miniature triumphal arch, decorated with carved inscriptions and sculptural elements that proclaimed Londinium's status as a proper Roman city deserving of the empire's protection and investment. These gates controlled not just movement but meaning, defining who belonged within the civic community and establishing clear boundaries between the civilized space of the city and the less certain world beyond its walls. The construction of permanent fortifications also reflected a subtle but significant shift in Roman strategic thinking about Britain as a whole. In the early decades following the conquest, military planners had viewed the island primarily as a frontier region, requiring active pacification and control. By the late 2nd century, however, Britain had become sufficiently integrated into the imperial system to justify the massive investment required for permanent urban fortifications. The London Wall announced to both residents and potential enemies that Rome intended to remain in Britain indefinitely, and that Londinium would serve as a permanent bastion of Roman civilization in the northern seas. The defensive circuit was complemented by a substantial military installation, located to the northwest of the civilian settlement, where archaeological evidence has revealed the remains of a fort capable of housing up to 1,000 soldiers. This Cripplegate Fort, as it has come to be known, provided Londinium with a permanent military garrison that could respond rapidly to any threats, while also serving the broader strategic needs of the province. The soldiers stationed here were not merely defenders, but active participants in the city's economic and social life, their wages contributing to local prosperity while their presence ensured the stability that made long-term investment and planning possible. The completion of the Great Stone Wall marked not merely the end of a massive construction project, but the beginning of Londinium's true golden age. Within the protective circuit of those towering ramparts, the city that had risen from the ashes of Boudicca's rebellion now reached a scale and sophistication that would have been unimaginable to the merchants and craftsmen who had built the first wooden shops along the muddy Thames crossing. By the middle of the 2nd century, Londinium had become something unprecedented in the history of Britain, a truly metropolitan centre whose influence extended far beyond its walls and whose daily rhythms were synchronized with the pulse of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. The sheer scale of the city's population during this period of zenith remains a subject of scholarly debate, but most estimates suggest that somewhere between 45 and 60,000 people lived within the walls of Londinium at the height of its prosperity. To comprehend what this meant in the context of 2nd century Britain, consider that this single urban centre contained more inhabitants than most entire tribal territories had supported in the pre-Roman era. This concentration of humanity created social and economic dynamics that were entirely new to the British experience, generating both opportunities and challenges that required constant innovation and adaptation. The diversity of this population reflected Londinium's role as the undisputed hub of imperial administration and commerce in Britain. Roman citizens born in Italy lived alongside Gallic merchants, Germanic soldiers, British craftsmen, Syrian traders, and Egyptian scribes, creating a cosmopolitan mixture that would have felt familiar to residents of Alexandria or Antioch, but utterly foreign to anyone whose experience was limited to the traditional tribal settlements of pre-conquest Britain. This diversity was not merely demographic, but profoundly cultural, linguistic, and economic, making Londinium a place where the entire Roman world could be encountered within the space of a few city blocks. Walk through the city during the busy morning hours of a market day in the year 150, when Londinium's prosperity has reached its absolute peak. The great forum pulses with activity as merchants from across the known world display their wares beneath the covered colonnades that shelter shoppers from the changeable British weather. Here, amphorae containing wine from the sun-drenched hillsides of southern Gaul stand beside jars of olive oil shipped from Spain and North Africa, their clay surfaces still bearing the seals and inscriptions that tracked their journey across thousands of miles of sea and land. British wool, prized throughout the empire for its exceptional quality, awaits loading onto ships that will carry it to workshops in Gaul and Germany, while finished textiles from those same workshops hang in the shops of local merchants who understand the preferences of their increasingly sophisticated customers. The port facilities along the Thames present a scene of almost ceaseless activity that speaks to Londinium's central role in the economic life of Roman Britain. Ocean-going vessels designed for the challenging waters of the English Channel unload their cargoes at wooden wharves that have been expanded repeatedly to accommodate the growing volume of trade. Smaller river barges carry goods upstream to settlements throughout the British interior, their holds filled with manufactured items, luxury goods and raw materials that will be distributed through networks of local merchants and traders. The customs officials who oversee this traffic, working from offices near the river port, collect revenues that flow directly to the imperial treasury, making Londinium one of the most valuable economic assets in the entire northern frontier of the empire. The administrative machinery that governed this complex urban organism operated from the magnificent civic complex that dominated the highest ground within the walls. The great basilica, with its soaring columns and decorated interior, served not merely as a courthouse, but as the nerve centre of provincial government for all of Roman Britain. Here, the provincial governor and his staff coordinated military campaigns on the northern frontier, managed the collection of taxes and tribute from across the island, and adjudicated the legal disputes that inevitably arose in a province as diverse and economically active as Britain had become. The decisions made in these halls affected the lives of millions of people scattered across hundreds of settlements, from the great military camps along Hadrian's Wall to the villa estates of the southern countryside. Yet it was perhaps in the everyday rhythms of ordinary life that Londinium's achievement was most remarkable. The city had successfully created urban institutions and social relationships that allowed people from radically different backgrounds to live and work together in relative harmony and mutual benefit. The taverns and bathhouses scattered throughout the residential districts served as informal meeting places where Roman citizens, British natives and foreign immigrants could socialise and conduct business across the boundaries of ethnicity and social status. The workshops and commercial establishments provided employment and economic opportunity for people whose ancestors had lived in worlds that barely knew the use of coined money, let alone the complex financial instruments that made long-distance trade possible. The military garrison that protected this prosperity operated from the substantial fort in the northwestern section of the city, where up to 1,000 soldiers maintained the security that made civilian life possible while also participating actively in the local economy as consumers and sometimes as investors in commercial ventures. These troops, drawn from auxiliary units recruited throughout the empire, brought their own cultural traditions and economic resources to the urban mix, while their presence provided the ultimate guarantee that the Roman peace would be maintained regardless of political disturbances elsewhere in the province or beyond its borders. Yet beneath the impressive facade of prosperity and imperial confidence that defined Londinium at its zenith lay networks of dependency and vulnerability that were largely invisible to the merchants conducting their daily business in the Great Forum, or the administrators managing provincial affairs from the Basilica. The very success of the city had created a web of connections and obligations that extended far beyond the protective circuit of its stone walls, linking the fate of every inhabitant to economic and political forces operating across thousands of miles of often unpredictable territory. Like the intricate system of aqueducts and drains that carried fresh water into the city and wastewater away from it, these commercial and administrative arteries were essential to urban life precisely because they operated below the level of everyday consciousness. The foundation of Londinium's wealth rested on its role as the great entrepot through which the resources of Britain flowed outward to the wider empire, and the manufactured goods and luxury items of the Roman world flowed inward to British consumers. This position had brought extraordinary prosperity to the merchants, craftsmen and administrators who made their livings facilitating these exchanges, but it had also created a fundamental dependence on the continued stability of trade routes and supply networks that stretched across the length and breadth of the Roman world. The wine that filled the amphorae stacked in Londinium's warehouses came from vineyards in Gaul that might be disrupted by local conflicts or poor harvests. The olive oil that lit the city's lamps and seasoned its food depended on peaceful conditions in Spain and North Africa. The exotic spices and silks that marked the highest levels of urban sophistication travelled through trade networks that passed through dozens of different political jurisdictions, any of which might impose new taxes, restrictions, or outright prohibitions that could disrupt the delicate balance of supply and demand on which the city's commercial life depended. This vulnerability to external disruption was compounded by the social stratification that prosperity had created within Londinium itself. The cosmopolitan mixing of peoples and cultures that gave the city its distinctive character had not eliminated the fundamental inequalities that marked Roman society throughout the empire. Indeed, in some ways the concentration of wealth and opportunity in Londinium had made these disparities more visible and potentially more troubling than they might have been in smaller, more homogeneous communities. At the apex of urban society stood the Roman citizens who dominated the major commercial enterprises and held the most important administrative positions, many of them immigrants from other provinces who had brought capital and connections that gave them decisive advantages in competing for the most profitable opportunities. Below this elite, a substantial middle class of craftsmen, small merchants, and skilled workers had emerged, many of them native Britons who had successfully adapted to Roman commercial practices and urban lifestyles. These people enjoyed a level of material comfort and social mobility that would have been unimaginable under the old tribal system, but their prosperity depended entirely on the continued expansion of trade and the stability of imperial institutions. A disruption in commerce, a reduction in administrative employment, or a shift in imperial policy could easily transform comfortable prosperity into economic insecurity. At the bottom of this social hierarchy were the numerous slaves, freedmen, and day labourers whose work made the city's prosperity possible, but who shared only marginally in its benefits. Many of these people were recent immigrants, displaced persons, or the descendants of war captives who had been absorbed into the Roman economic system without acquiring the legal protections or social connections that might have provided them with greater security. Their vulnerability to exploitation and abuse created tensions that simmered beneath the surface of daily life, occasionally erupting into conflicts that reminded the urban elite that their comfortable existence depended on the acquiescence of people who had little reason to feel loyalty to the system that employed them. The cultural diversity that made Londinium such a vibrant and cosmopolitan centre also contained the seeds of potential fragmentation and conflict. While the shared institutions of Roman law and administration provided a framework within which different ethnic and cultural groups could coexist and cooperate, they did not eliminate the deeper loyalties and resentments that people carried with them from their places of origin. British natives who had prospered under Roman rule might still feel conflicted about their relationship to a system that had been imposed on their ancestors through conquest. Immigrant merchants and craftsmen from other provinces might find themselves caught between competing demands for loyalty to their adopted home and to the communities they had left behind. Germanic soldiers serving in the urban garrison might discover that their primary allegiance was to their military commanders rather than to the civilian population they were supposed to protect. These underlying tensions were usually managed successfully through the informal networks of patronage, friendship, and mutual obligation that bound together the various elements of urban society, but they created potential fault lines that could widen under pressure. Economic hardship, political instability, or military threat could transform the creative tensions of cultural diversity into destructive conflicts that might tear apart the social fabric that held the city together. Perhaps most troubling of all was the simple fact that Londinium's entire existence depended on the continued strength and stability of an empire that was beginning to show signs of strain even during the city's golden age. The resources required to maintain the roads, bridges, and port facilities that made trade possible came ultimately from imperial taxation. The legal and administrative systems that protected property rights and enforced contracts depended on the authority of distant emperors whose attention might be diverted to other priorities. The military forces that guaranteed security against external threats were part of an imperial army that might be redeployed to meet crises elsewhere in the empire without regard for local consequences. The first subtle signs that the golden age of Londinium might not endure indefinitely began to appear in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, not as dramatic crises or sudden catastrophes, but as barely perceptible shifts in the rhythms and assumptions that had governed urban life for generations. These changes arrived like the first gentle winds that herald an approaching storm, so gradual and seemingly insignificant that most residents of the great city would have dismissed them as temporary inconveniences rather than harbingers of fundamental transformation. Yet for those with eyes to see and the experience to interpret what they observed, these early warning signs revealed uncomfortable truths about the fragility of the imperial system on which Londinium's prosperity ultimately depended. The Roman Empire of the late 2nd century was no longer the confident, expanding power that had conquered Britain and built Londinium's first wooden bridge across the Thames. Across the vast territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, imperial administrators faced challenges that were both more complex and more persistent than anything their predecessors had encountered during the great age of conquest and consolidation. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed against the imperial borders with increasing frequency and sophistication, requiring constant vigilance and periodic military campaigns that drained resources from other priorities. In the east, the revived Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty posed threats that demanded the deployment of entire legions and the attention of the most capable generals. Within the empire itself, economic pressures created by the costs of maintaining such extensive frontiers began to manifest themselves in currency debasements, increased taxation, and growing tension between the imperial government and the provincial populations who bore the burden of supporting the military machine. These distant troubles might have seemed irrelevant to a merchant conducting business in Londinium's forum, or a craftsman working in one of the city's prosperous workshops, but the connections that bound the empire together ensured that no part of the Roman world could remain entirely insulated from problems elsewhere. When military campaigns on the Germanic frontiers required additional troops, some of those soldiers came from the British garrison, subtly reducing the security that had allowed civilian life to flourish without constant anxiety about external threats. When imperial revenues fell short of imperial expenses, new taxes were imposed on provincial communities, including the prosperous cities of Britain, whose wealth made them attractive targets for fiscal exploitation. When political instability in Rome itself led to rapid changes in imperial policy and personnel, the effects rippled outward through the administrative networks that governed daily life in every corner of the empire. Perhaps most significantly, the empire's growing financial difficulties began to affect the massive infrastructure investments that had made Roman civilization possible. The roads that carried Londinium's trade to markets throughout Britain required constant maintenance, but imperial resources increasingly went to military priorities rather than civilian conveniences. The port facilities along the Thames needed regular dredging and repair, but such projects competed for attention with more urgent demands from frontier commanders who faced immediate military threats. The aqueducts, sewers, and other engineering works that supported urban life continued to function, but with less regular maintenance and fewer resources allocated to improvements and expansion. The construction of Londinium's Great Stone Wall during this period can be understood, at least in part, as a response to this growing sense of uncertainty. While the defensive circuit certainly reflected the city's continued importance and prosperity, it also represented a subtle shift from the confident expansiveness of earlier generations to a more cautious mentality that emphasized protection and preparation for potential troubles. The massive investment required for such fortifications suggested that imperial planners could no longer take for granted the internal security that had previously made city walls unnecessary in most parts of Britain. The very existence of these defences, however impressive and well built, indicated an acknowledgement that the future might be less predictable and benign than the past had been. Within Londinium itself, these broader imperial difficulties began to manifest themselves in small but telling ways that affected the daily experience of urban life. The supply of certain imported luxury goods became less reliable, as trade routes faced increased disruption from military operations and political instability. The cost of maintaining the elaborate public buildings that had symbolized the city's golden age gradually became more burdensome, as imperial subsidies decreased and local resources were stretched by higher taxes. The cosmopolitan population that had given Londinium its distinctive character began to show signs of strain as economic pressures intensified competition for employment and resources, occasionally erupting into the kind of ethnic and social tensions that had been largely absent during the prosperous decades of the city's prime. The imperial bureaucracy that administered both the city and the broader province of Britain became less efficient and more corrupt as career opportunities diminished, and official salaries failed to keep pace with rising costs. Positions that had once attracted capable administrators from across the empire increasingly went to local appointees whose primary qualifications were personal connections rather than administrative competence. The legal system that had provided reliable frameworks for commercial transactions and property rights began to show signs of political influence and arbitrary decision-making that made long-term planning more difficult and risky. Yet these changes occurred so gradually that most residents of Londinium adapted to them without fully recognizing their cumulative significance. The city remained prosperous by any historical standard, its population continued to grow, and its role as the administrative and commercial centre of Roman Britain seemed secure. The great stone walls stood as solid proof of imperial commitment to the city's defence, while the continued flow of goods through the Thames port demonstrated that trade networks remained viable despite occasional disruptions. The physical fabric of Londinium itself began to tell the story of these gradual changes in ways that were perhaps more honest than the official proclamations or the reassuring rhetoric of imperial administrators. Stone and mortar, unlike human memory or political propaganda, cannot dissemble or rationalize away the evidence of declining resources and shifting priorities. In the layers of rubble and repair work that archaeologists would uncover centuries later, in the makeshift, modifications and expedient adaptations that became increasingly common as the 3rd century progressed, the buildings themselves recorded a narrative of pragmatic adjustment to circumstances that no one wished to acknowledge openly. The great civic buildings that had symbolized Londinium's golden age required constant maintenance to preserve their impressive appearance and functional efficiency. The basilica with its soaring columns and decorated interior, the forum with its covered walkways and paved surfaces, the public baths with their complex heating systems and marble appointments, all of these monuments to Roman engineering and urban sophistication depended on regular investment in repairs, renovations and improvements to counteract the inevitable effects of weather, use, and simple aging. During the prosperous decades of the 2nd century, such maintenance had been undertaken with the same attention to quality and permanence that had characterized the original construction, using the finest materials available and employing craftsmen whose skills matched those of their predecessors. As resources became scarcer and priorities shifted, however, the character of this maintenance work began to change in subtle but telling ways. Broken stones were replaced not with freshly quarried blocks of matching quality, but with recycled materials salvaged from older structures or inferior local stone that cost less to transport and install. Decorative elements that had been carved with careful attention to classical proportions and artistic excellence were repaired with simpler, more utilitarian workmanship that emphasized function over beauty. The intricate mosaic floors that had graced the most important public spaces were patched with plain tesselli when sections wore out or were damaged, creating a patchwork appearance that spoke to changed circumstances as clearly as any written record. Most significant of all, new construction projects became increasingly rare and modest in scope compared to the ambitious building programs that had transformed Londinium during its early centuries. When the city's defensive walls were extended to include protection along the Thames waterfront, sometime during the middle of the 3rd century, the work was carried out using a mixture of new stone and recycled materials taken from earlier structures. Archaeological examination of this riverside wall has revealed the systematic reuse of sculptural elements, inscribed stones, and architectural fragments that had originally been part of monuments, tombs, and buildings scattered throughout the city. This practice of spoliation, as archaeologists term it, represented not mere economy, but a fundamental shift in attitudes toward the built environment and the relationship between past and present. The decision to dismantle older monuments and reuse their stone in new construction projects reflected more than simple pragmatism, though practical considerations were certainly important as the costs of quarrying and transporting fresh stone continued to rise. It also revealed a subtle but profound change in how the people of Londinium understood their relationship to their own history and the permanence of their urban institutions. The generations who had built the great public buildings of the 2nd century had conceived of them as permanent monuments that would endure for centuries, symbols of Roman power and civilization that would inspire respect and admiration in future generations. The fact that their descendants were willing to cannibalize these structures for building materials suggests a different understanding of the future, one in which immediate practical needs took precedence over abstract ideals of permanence and grandeur. The workshops and commercial buildings that formed the economic heart of the city underwent similar processes of adaptation and economization. Archaeological evidence reveals that many of the timber frame structures that housed craftsmen and merchants were repeatedly modified and rebuilt using increasingly simple construction techniques and cheaper materials. Where earlier workshops had featured carefully planned layouts, optimized for specific types of production, later renovations often created more generic spaces that could be easily adapted to different uses as economic conditions changed. The hip-coursed heating systems that had made Roman buildings comfortable during Britain's cold winters were gradually abandoned in favour of simpler brazier heating that required less maintenance but provided less effective temperature control. Even private residences reflected these broader patterns of declining investment in long-term infrastructure. The comfortable houses of successful merchants and administrators, with their painted walls, tiled roofs, and small private gardens, required constant upkeep to maintain their civilized appearance and urban amenities. As the economic foundation for such luxury became less secure, homeowners increasingly opted for simpler solutions. Plain painted walls instead of elaborate frescoes, wooden shingles instead of expensive tiles, kitchen gardens instead of ornamental plantings. These changes might seem minor when considered individually, but collectively they represented a gradual retreat from the urban sophistication that had marked Londinium's golden age. The cumulative effect of all these small adaptations and economies was to create a cityscape that retained the basic structure and layout of its prosperous predecessor, while quietly abandoning many of the refinements and embellishments that had made it a worthy rival to the great cities of Gaul and the Mediterranean. The transformation of Londinium from thriving provincial capital to gradually abandoned relic was not accomplished through any single dramatic event or catastrophic decision, but rather through the slow, almost imperceptible withdrawal of the imperial presence that had given the city its reason for existence. Like a tide that recedes so gradually that observers might not notice the change from hour to hour, yet inevitably leaves behind empty pools and exposed mudflats where deep water once flowed, the retreat of Roman authority from Britain unfolded across decades in ways that were often barely visible to those experiencing them day by day. Yet the cumulative effect of these seemingly minor adjustments and economies proved more devastating to urban life than any military conquest or natural disaster could have been. The process began not with any formal declaration of abandonment, but with the quiet redeployment of troops and administrators to regions where imperial priorities demanded their presence more urgently. As threats mounted along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, as Germanic tribes pressed with increasing success against the northern boundaries of the Roman world, as internal civil wars consumed resources and attention, Britain gradually slipped from the centre of imperial consciousness to its periphery. The island province that had once represented a significant achievement of Roman arms and a valuable source of tribute and trade became instead a distant responsibility that consumed more resources than it generated, a drain on imperial finances rather than a contributor to imperial strength. The first signs of this shift appeared in the form of reduced garrison strength throughout the province. Auxiliary units that had protected trade routes and maintained civil order were quietly transferred to more threatened frontiers, their departure masked by administrative euphemisms that spoke of temporary redeployments and strategic repositioning. The great military camps along Hadrian's Wall began to show signs of reduced manning, with sections of fortifications left unmaintained and watchtowers abandoned when there were insufficient troops to staff them properly. In Londinium itself, the urban garrison that had provided both security and economic stimulus gradually shrank as soldiers were recalled to more pressing duties elsewhere. The withdrawal of military protection inevitably led to a corresponding reduction in the civilian administrative apparatus that had governed Roman Britain from Londinium's Basilica and Forum. Provincial officials who had once competed for prestigious postings in Britain found themselves reassigned to provinces closer to the centres of imperial power, where their careers might benefit from proximity to important decision-makers. The complex bureaucracy that had managed taxation, legal affairs and public works throughout the province was steadily reduced in size and effectiveness as positions were eliminated or left unfilled when their occupants departed for other assignments. As the machinery of imperial government contracted, the economic networks that had sustained Londinium's prosperity began to unravel with increasing speed. Trade routes that had once been protected by Roman military presence became dangerous as local security deteriorated and banditry increased. The complex financial arrangements that had facilitated commerce across vast distances depended ultimately on the stability and reliability of imperial institutions. When those institutions weakened, the confidence that made long-distance trade possible evaporated as well. Merchants who had once been eager to invest in British ventures began to redirect their capital toward regions where Roman authority remained strong and predictable. The great public buildings that had symbolized Londinium's status as a proper Roman city gradually fell into disrepair as the imperial subsidies that had funded their maintenance were diverted to more pressing military and administrative needs. The basilica, with its impressive columns and decorated interior, became too expensive to heat during the cold British winters. The public baths, with their complex hypocauste systems and constant need for fuel and maintenance, were abandoned in favour of simpler private facilities that individual households could afford to operate. The Forum, once the bustling heart of commercial and civic life, grew quiet as the official ceremonies and public business that had brought people together moved elsewhere or simply ceased to occur. Perhaps most significantly, the population of Londinium itself began to decline, as the economic and administrative functions that had attracted people to the city were eliminated or relocated. Merchants and craftsmen whose livelihoods depended on imperial demand found themselves without customers as military units departed and bureaucratic positions were eliminated. The cosmopolitan mix of peoples that had given the city its distinctive character gradually dispersed as immigrants returned to their homelands or sought opportunities in regions where Roman institutions remained viable. Even native Britons who had built successful urban careers found themselves forced to consider alternatives as the city that had provided them with prosperity and social advancement slowly emptied of the activities that had made such success possible. The physical abandonment of urban infrastructure followed logically from these demographic and economic changes. Streets that had once bustled with traffic grew quiet as there were fewer people to use them and less reason for movement within the city. The water supply system, dependent on constant maintenance to remain functional, began to fail as technical expertise departed with the Roman administration. The sewage system, one of the great engineering achievements that had made dense urban living possible, gradually clogged and broke down without proper upkeep. Yet through all of these changes, the great stone wall that had been built to protect Londinium's golden age remained standing, its massive blocks and distinctive red tile courses as solid and impressive as they had been on the day of their completion. The wall had become a monument to a vanished world, enclosing empty spaces and abandoned buildings, protecting nothing more significant than the memories of what had once been Britain's greatest city. What remained of Londinium after the tide of imperial authority had finally receded was neither the dramatic wreckage of conquest nor the romantic ruins beloved of later poets and antiquarians, but something far more poignant and archaeologically honest: the quiet persistence of stone and mortar, the patient endurance of foundations and fragments, the mute testimony of everyday objects left behind by people who had simply walked away from a world that no longer offered them what they needed to survive. These remnants tell a story not of violent destruction but of gradual abandonment, of a great city that slowly returned to the earth, not through fire or sword, but through the simple passage of time and the inexorable processes of decay that claim all human works when care and attention are withdrawn. The most substantial survivor of this slow dissolution was the great stone wall that had been built to protect Londinium at the height of its prosperity and confidence. The massive circuit of Kentish ragstone and red tile courses proved more durable than the urban civilization it had been designed to defend, its foundations deep enough and its construction solid enough to resist the centuries of weather, vegetation, and human neglect that gradually claimed most other traces of Roman presence. Sections of this wall would endure for more than a millennium, incorporated into later defensive schemes and serving new purposes that their original builders could never have imagined, silent witnesses to the vanished world they had once enclosed. Within the protected area that these walls had defined, the great public buildings that had formed the ceremonial and administrative heart of Roman Londinium underwent a slower but no less complete transformation. The basilica, with its soaring columns and marble-appointed interior, did not collapse in a single dramatic moment, but rather succumbed to the patient work of British weather and the gradual failure of its complex structural systems. Without regular maintenance, the lead seals that joined the stone blocks began to deteriorate, allowing water to penetrate the walls and freeze during winter months, slowly splitting apart masonry that had been fitted with millimetric precision. The wooden elements of the building, roof timbers, floor supports, interior partitions, provided fuel and building materials for the scattered population that continued to inhabit the area, leaving behind only the stone foundations and lowest courses of walls that were too massive to be easily moved or reused. The forum that had once bustled with the commercial and civic life of the province suffered a similar fate, its paved surfaces gradually disappearing beneath the layers of soil and debris as the drainage systems that had kept them clear and functional fell into disrepair. The covered colonnades that had sheltered merchants and shoppers from the British weather lost their roofs first, then saw their columns toppled or removed for use in other construction projects, until only irregular lines of stone blocks marked where once the heart of imperial commerce had pulsed with daily activity. Archaeological excavation in later centuries would reveal the ghostly outlines of this vanished grandeur, preserved in foundation trenches and scattered architectural fragments that spoke eloquently of vanished ambitions and abandoned dreams. The residential areas of the city underwent their own process of slow dissolution, as houses built for urban lifestyles were gradually abandoned by owners who found rural life more practical and affordable in the absence of imperial administration. Some of these structures were systematically dismantled by their former occupants, who carried away valuable building materials, stone blocks, roof tiles, window glass, metal fixtures, to use in simpler dwellings constructed outside the city walls. Others were simply left empty, their wooden elements gradually consumed by weather and insects, their masonry walls slowly undermined by vegetation, and the patient work of frost and rain. The hypocaust heating systems that had made comfortable urban living possible during Britain's harsh winters became particular casualties of this abandonment, as their complex networks of underground flues and furnace chambers required not only regular maintenance, but specialized knowledge that departed along with the Roman population. Without proper operation, these systems quickly became clogged with debris and collapsed under the weight of accumulated rubble, though their foundations would survive to puzzle later archaeologists who struggled to understand the sophisticated climate control technology that had once made British cities as comfortable as those of the Mediterranean. Yet perhaps the most poignant remnants of vanished Londinium were the countless small objects of daily life that its former residents left behind in their gradual exodus. Pottery vessels still bearing the fingerprints of their makers, bronze coins scattered in the debris of collapsed shops, jewellery lost in the ruins of abandoned houses, fragments of glass vessels that had once held wine and oil imported from distant provinces. These humble artefacts, preserved by accident rather than intention, provide the most intimate connection to the lived experience of people whose names and faces have been lost to history, but whose daily struggles and small pleasures are recorded in the durable materials they touched and used. The collective memory of what Londinium had been began to fade almost as quickly as its physical structures succumbed to neglect and decay. The generation that had experienced the city's abandonment passed away, and their children and grandchildren grew up in a world where urban life was only a dimly remembered dream. The complex administrative and commercial systems that had made Roman civilization possible were forgotten along with the Latin language in which they had been conducted, leaving behind only fragments of vocabulary and half-understood customs that gradually merged with older British traditions. As centuries passed and the physical remnants of Roman Londinium slowly disappeared beneath layers of soil and newer construction, the memory of what had once stood beside the Thames began to transform in ways that followed the ancient patterns by which human societies preserve and distort their past. What had been a concrete historical reality, a city of stone and timber, inhabited by real people pursuing practical goals, gradually became something more elusive and mysterious. A half-remembered dream of vanished grandeur, a collection of fragments and rumours that successive generations interpreted according to their own needs and understanding. In this slow metamorphosis from history into legend, the true story of Roman Londinium became buried as thoroughly as its foundations had been entombed beneath medieval streets. The people who lived in and around the old Roman site during the centuries following its abandonment were not entirely ignorant of what had come before them. The great stone wall remained visible and impressive, too massive to be easily demolished or ignored, while scattered ruins of substantial buildings continued to protrude from the earth like the bones of some gigantic skeleton. Local inhabitants developed their own explanations for these mysterious remnants, weaving them into stories that made sense within their own cultural frameworks, but bore increasingly little resemblance to the historical realities they purported to explain. Some of these folk traditions preserved genuine memories in distorted form, like voices heard through thick walls or faces glimpsed in troubled water. Stories circulated of ancient kings who had built great halls and palaces on the site, conflating Roman governors with legendary British rulers and attributing Roman engineering achievements to mythical figures whose deeds grew more extraordinary with each retelling. The sophisticated urban infrastructure that had made dense settlement possible was remembered, if at all, as the work of giants or spirits, supernatural beings whose powers could account for accomplishments that seemed impossible to people whose own technology was far simpler and more limited. Other elements of local tradition represented pure invention, the creative efforts of communities to provide meaningful explanations for landscape features they could observe but not understand. The elaborate drainage systems and underground passages that had once served practical municipal functions were transformed in popular imagination into secret tunnels used by mysterious cults or hidden passages that connected to distant parts of the realm. The scattered fragments of carved stone that occasionally turned up in fields and gardens became evidence of ancient battles or monuments to forgotten heroes, their true origins as decorative elements from Roman public buildings lost to memory. Perhaps most significantly, the very concept of urban civilization as the Romans had practiced it became so foreign to post-Roman British experience that people could no longer imagine their ancestors living in the kinds of communities that Londinium had actually been. The complex social and economic relationships that had sustained a population of tens of thousands within a few square miles were beyond the comprehension of societies organised around small agricultural settlements and kinship networks. When later generations tried to understand what the Roman ruins represented, they inevitably interpreted them in terms of their own simpler social structures, imagining perhaps a great lord's hall and its associated buildings rather than the integrated urban community that had actually existed. The gradual Christianization of Britain added another layer of reinterpretation to these evolving traditions, as pagan Roman monuments were either demonized as the works of evil spirits or sanctified through association with early Christian martyrs and saints. Churches were sometimes built directly on top of Roman foundations, creating physical continuities that fostered legends about the conversion of ancient temples and the triumph of Christian faith over pagan delusion. These stories often preserved accurate information about the locations of Roman religious sites, while completely transforming their historical significance and cultural meaning. The linguistic changes that accompanied political and social transformation also contributed to the mythologization of Roman memory. As Latin disappeared from common use and was replaced by various Celtic and Germanic languages, the very names of places and institutions lost their original meanings and were subject to folk etymologies that created entirely new stories about their origins and significance. Streets and districts that had been named after Roman officials or geographical features were reinterpreted according to the vocabulary and cultural assumptions of their new inhabitants, generating legends that bore no relationship to historical reality but seemed perfectly plausible to people who lacked access to written records or scholarly traditions. By the time medieval chroniclers began to take interest in the ancient history of their regions, the gap between legend and reality had become so wide that even learned men found it difficult to distinguish between authentic historical memories and pure folklore. The scattered references to Londinium in surviving Roman texts were often misunderstood or misinterpreted, while the abundant legendary material that had accumulated over the centuries was frequently accepted as historically reliable, simply because it had been repeated so often and with such conviction. The rediscovery of authentic information about Roman Londinium had to wait for the development of archaeological methods and historical scholarship that could distinguish between different types of evidence and evaluate their reliability according to systematic criteria. The resurrection of authentic knowledge about Roman Londinium began not in libraries or lecture halls, but in the most unlikely of circumstances, beneath the bustling streets of modern London, where the demands of 20th and 21st century construction inadvertently became the instruments of historical revelation. Each time developers broke ground for new office buildings, each time engineers dug trenches for underground utilities, each time the expanding infrastructure of a growing metropolis required excavation into the ancient soil, they risked disturbing layers of earth that had remained undisturbed for more than 15 centuries. What they uncovered in these moments of accidental archaeological discovery would gradually piece together a picture of the vanished city that was far more accurate and detailed than any medieval chronicle or local tradition had preserved. The first systematic recognition of what lay buried beneath London came in the 19th century, when the great expansion of the city's commercial district required extensive excavation work in precisely the areas where Roman Londinium had once flourished. Construction workers digging foundations for new banks and insurance buildings began to encounter massive stone walls and carefully laid pavements that clearly predated any known medieval construction. The discovery of coins, pottery fragments, and architectural elements bearing Latin inscriptions left no doubt that these remains represented something far older and more sophisticated than anyone had previously suspected. But it was only with the development of modern archaeological methods and the patient application of scientific rigour to the interpretation of material evidence that the true scope and character of Roman London began to emerge from its long concealment. The archaeologists who descended into construction sites and basement excavations brought with them techniques for dating artifacts, analysing soil layers, and reconstructing ancient environments that allowed them to read the buried landscape like a vast and complex text written in stone, pottery, and organic debris. The London Museum's archaeological collections gradually accumulated a treasure trove of evidence that spoke to every aspect of life in Roman Londinium: fragments of fine pottery that revealed the extent of international trade networks, pieces of building stone that documented construction techniques and architectural styles, coins that provided precise dates for different phases of urban development, organic materials preserved in waterlogged deposits that offered glimpses into diet, clothing, and daily activities. Each artifact, however humble, contributed another piece to an enormous puzzle that was slowly revealing the outlines of a vanished world. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in this process of rediscovery came with the excavation of the London Mithraeum in the 1950s, when construction work near the Walbrook uncovered the remarkably preserved remains of the underground temple that had served the mystery religion's adherents during Londinium's Golden Age. The discovery of marble sculptures, altars, and architectural elements in their original positions provided archaeologists with their most complete picture of religious life in Roman London, while the excellent state of preservation demonstrated how much more evidence might still lie hidden beneath the modern city. The methodical exploration of this single site revealed the extraordinary complexity of what lay beneath London's surface. Layer upon layer of occupation debris, construction episodes, repairs, and abandonment told the story not just of a single building, but of the entire district in which it had operated. The archaeologists, working by artificial light in cramped excavation areas, could trace the evolution of the neighbourhood from early timber structures through successive phases of stone construction, documenting the growth, prosperity, and eventual decline of this particular corner of the Roman city. As excavation techniques became more sophisticated and opportunities for investigation multiplied, a detailed map of Roman Londinium began to emerge from the accumulated evidence of dozens of individual dig sites. The discovery of substantial sections of the city wall at various points around the modern city of London confirmed the impressive scale of the Roman fortifications, while the uncovering of forum and basilica foundations revealed the locations and dimensions of the great public buildings that had dominated the ancient cityscape. The identification of residential areas, workshop districts, and religious precincts gradually filled in the picture of how the urban space had been organised and used. The most recent chapter in this ongoing process of rediscovery came with the 2025 excavation on Gracechurch Street, where construction of a new office building uncovered exceptionally well-preserved remains of the Roman basilica's two-storey structure. This find, occurring nearly 2 millennia after the building's original construction, demonstrated both how much has been learned about Roman London and how much still remains to be discovered. The careful documentation of foundation layouts, construction techniques, and architectural details provided archaeologists with their clearest picture yet of how these monumental public buildings had actually appeared and functioned. Each new discovery serves to refine and complicate the emerging picture of what Roman Londinium had been like, replacing the simplified narratives of earlier scholarship with increasingly nuanced understandings of the city's development, prosperity, and decline. The evidence emerging from the ground reveals a community that was simultaneously more cosmopolitan and more fragile than previous generations had imagined, more successful in its achievements, and more vulnerable to the broader forces that ultimately brought about its abandonment. The London that began to take shape in the centuries following the Roman withdrawal was neither a simple continuation of Londinium nor a complete break with its urban predecessor, but rather something more complex and historically fascinating, a gradual reoccupation and transformation of the same strategic riverside location that had originally attracted Roman engineers and planners centuries earlier. The Thames still flowed between the same banks, the hills still rose at the same gentle angles, and the fundamental geographical advantages that had made this crossing point attractive to one civilization proved equally compelling to those that followed. Yet the new communities that slowly established themselves along the river approached urban life with different assumptions, different technologies, and different social structures that would gradually reshape both the physical landscape and the cultural memory of what had come before. The earliest post-Roman settlements did not initially reoccupy the area within the old city walls, but instead established themselves to the west of the abandoned Roman site, creating what archaeologists now know as Londinium, a trading settlement that stretched along the Thames waterfront in what is now the Covent Garden and Strand areas of central London. This Anglo-Saxon London differed fundamentally from its Roman predecessor in almost every significant way. Where Londinium had been a planned urban centre with monumental public buildings and sophisticated infrastructure, Londinium was a more organic commercial settlement focused primarily on river trade and craft production, its buildings simple timber structures that left far fewer traces in the archaeological record than the stone monuments of the Roman era. For several centuries, the old Roman city remained largely empty, its walls standing as impressive but unused monuments to a vanished world, while new forms of urban life developed nearby. The great basilica and forum lay in ruins, their broken columns and scattered masonry providing building materials for anyone willing to cart away the stone. But the essential urban functions they had once housed were now served by simpler structures built according to different architectural traditions. The shift from stone to timber construction, from planned public spaces to organic commercial development, from imperial administration to local governance, marked a fundamental transformation in how urban communities understood their relationship to the built environment and to each other. Yet even as the focus of settlement moved westward, the old Roman walls retained their practical value and symbolic significance. These massive stone fortifications, built to protect a city that no longer existed, still provided the most formidable defensive barrier in the region, and when political circumstances made security a priority, the abandoned Roman site began to attract new inhabitants who appreciated the protection that ancient engineering could still provide. By the late Anglo-Saxon period, settlement had begun to return within the walls, creating a curious hybrid community that lived among Roman ruins while conducting its daily business, according to entirely different cultural patterns. The medieval city that gradually emerged within and around the old Roman perimeter represented a fascinating palimpsest of historical layers, each generation building upon the remains of its predecessors while adapting inherited structures to new purposes and new needs. Substantial sections of the Roman wall were incorporated directly into medieval defensive schemes, their red tile courses and distinctive masonry techniques still visible among later additions and repairs. Where Roman gates had once controlled access to the city, medieval builders constructed new entrance points that served the same basic function while reflecting different architectural traditions and military technologies. Churches built on the sites of Roman temples created physical continuities that fostered both accurate memories and creative legends about the transformation of pagan spaces into Christian sanctuaries. The Church of St. Bartholomew the Great, constructed partly on Roman foundations, exemplified this process of adaptive reuse, its medieval builders incorporating ancient masonry into new structures that served entirely different religious and social purposes. Such buildings became repositories of memory that preserved knowledge about Roman construction techniques and urban planning, even as they transformed the meaning and function of the spaces they occupied. The street pattern that emerged in medieval London bore clear traces of Roman planning, with many important thoroughfares following routes that had been established nearly a millennium earlier. The great Roman roads that had once radiated outward from Londinium continued to channel traffic toward the Thames crossing, ensuring that trade and communication networks maintained essential continuities even as political and cultural systems underwent fundamental transformation. Modern London streets like Bishopsgate, Aldersgate and Ludgate preserve in their very names the memory of Roman entrance points, while their alignments still follow routes originally surveyed by imperial engineers. The Thames itself remained the most important constant in this evolving urban landscape, its tides and currents unchanged by the rise and fall of civilizations along its banks. Medieval Londoners, like their Roman predecessors, built their wharves and warehouses along the riverfront, used the water for transportation and waste disposal, and organised much of their economic life around the rhythms of maritime trade. The wooden bridges that medieval engineers constructed to span the river served the same essential function as the Roman bridge that had first made urban development possible at this location, though they reflected different engineering traditions and construction capabilities. Today, in the 21st century, the physical remnants of Roman Londinium exist in a state of perpetual tension between preservation and destruction, their survival dependent on the continued vigilance and care of people who understand their historical significance, but who must constantly defend them against the relentless pressures of urban development and modern life. These fragments of stone and mortar, these scattered pieces of mosaic and sculpture, represent some of the most tangible connections we possess to the daily lives and grand ambitions of people who lived and died nearly 2,000 years ago. Yet they remain extraordinarily vulnerable to forces that care nothing for their age or rarity. Walk through the modern city of London on any busy weekday morning, and you will pass within yards of Roman walls and foundations without necessarily being aware of their presence. At Tower Hill, a substantial section of the great defensive circuit built in the late 2nd century stands exposed to view, its distinctive courses of ragstone and red tile as clearly visible as they were on the day of their completion, yet surrounded now by office buildings and traffic that create an environment utterly alien to anything its builders could have imagined. The preservation of this particular stretch of wall represents a minor miracle of urban planning and historical consciousness, the result of deliberate decisions made by city officials who recognized its value and chose to protect it even at considerable cost and inconvenience. Elsewhere in the city, other remnants of the Roman past survive in more precarious circumstances, tucked away in basement levels of modern buildings or preserved within the confines of small urban parks, where they compete for space and attention with the countless demands of contemporary metropolitan life. The remains of a Roman amphitheatre lie buried beneath the Guildhall Art Gallery, their location marked by subtle differences in the pavement pattern that most passers-by never notice. The foundations of Roman bathhouses and residential buildings have been incorporated into the basement structures of banks and office towers, where they serve as conversation pieces for building tours while remaining invisible to the thousands of people who work above them every day. Perhaps nowhere is the fragility of this archaeological heritage more apparent than in the constant process of negotiation between developers and preservation authorities that accompanies every major construction project in the historic heart of London. Each time someone proposes to build a new skyscraper or renovate an existing structure, archaeologists must race against construction schedules to document and preserve whatever Roman remains might lie in the path of progress. The 2025 discovery of basilica foundations on Gracechurch Street exemplified both the potential for unexpected revelations and the time pressures that constantly threaten to limit proper investigation and preservation of such finds. The survival of these remnants depends not only on official protection, but on the continued existence of institutions and expertise capable of recognizing their significance and caring for them appropriately. The Museum of London and other repositories of Roman artefacts require ongoing funding and professional staff to maintain their collections, conduct research, and educate the public about the importance of preserving these connections to the past. The archaeologists who excavate and interpret Roman sites need training, equipment, and employment opportunities that may not always align with the economic priorities of a rapidly changing city. Even the most carefully preserved and protected Roman remains face constant threats from the simple passage of time and the corrosive effects of modern urban environments. The air pollution generated by millions of vehicles and countless industrial processes gradually eats away at ancient stonework, while vibrations from heavy traffic and underground railways create stresses that Roman engineers could never have anticipated when they calculated the structural requirements for their buildings. The very success of modern London as a thriving commercial centre creates environmental conditions that are hostile to the preservation of ancient materials and structures. The lime mortar that bound Roman masonry together was designed to endure for centuries, but it was not formulated to resist the chemical composition of 21st century rainfall, laden with industrial pollutants that slowly dissolve the bonds between stones and weaken the structural integrity of walls that have stood for nearly 2 millennia. The lead pipes and bronze fittings that once carried water through Roman buildings are now valuable enough as scrap metal to attract thieves who care nothing for their historical significance, while the stone blocks and decorative elements that survived 15 centuries of neglect and reuse may disappear overnight if they are not properly secured and monitored. Perhaps most troubling of all is the gradual loss of the specialized knowledge and traditional craftsmanship required to maintain and repair Roman structures according to appropriate historical methods. The techniques used by Roman builders represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of practical experience, but many of these skills disappeared along with the civilization that created them and must now be painstakingly reconstructed by modern craftsmen working from archaeological evidence and experimental archaeology. The irony of our situation is that we know more about Roman Londinium today than any generation since its abandonment, yet this knowledge exists primarily in academic publications and museum displays that reach only a tiny fraction of the population that walks daily above its buried remains. The disconnect between scholarly understanding and public awareness means that the political support necessary for long-term preservation efforts remains fragile and subject to changing priorities and budget constraints. The most remarkable aspect of Roman Londinium's legacy is not what has been lost or destroyed, but rather what continues to exist in hidden continuity beneath the surface of modern London, shaping the daily experience of millions of people who remain largely unaware that they are living and working within the ghostly outline of a city that flourished and faded nearly 2 millennia ago. The boundaries that defined Roman Londinium still determine the geographic and administrative limits of what is today known as the City of London, that peculiar square mile of ancient privileges and modern finance that occupies almost precisely the same territory that was once enclosed by the great stone wall of the imperial capital. This is not mere coincidence, but the persistence of geographic logic and human habit across centuries of political and cultural transformation. Every morning, as thousands of commuters stream into the financial district through Liverpool Street, Moorgate, and London Bridge stations, they are following routes that echo the approach roads that once carried merchants and officials to the gates of Roman Londinium. The streets they walk, Bishopsgate, Aldersgate, Newgate Street, preserve in their very names the memory of Roman entrance points while their alignments still follow the surveyor's lines that imperial engineers laid down when the empire was young and Britain was a distant frontier province. The invisible persistence of these ancient patterns demonstrates how deeply urban geography becomes embedded in the landscape, creating channels for human movement that endure long after the original reasons for their existence have been forgotten. The Thames itself remains the most obvious continuity between ancient and modern London, its tidal reach and seasonal moods unchanged by all the centuries of human ambition that have flourished and failed along its banks. The river that carried Roman grain ships and Germanic raiders, medieval merchants and Tudor courtiers, Victorian steamers and modern pleasure craft, continues to flow between banks that have been rebuilt countless times, but never moved far from their original positions. The London Bridge that spans the Thames today stands within yards of where Roman engineers constructed their first permanent crossing, while the wharves and embankments that line the modern waterfront rest on foundations that have been raised and rebuilt over Roman quays and Roman warehouses, whose wooden timbers still lie buried in the Thames mud. Walk through the narrow lanes of the medieval city during the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, when the crowds of office workers have dispersed and the ancient street pattern becomes more apparent, and you can sense the Roman skeleton beneath the modern flesh. Gracechurch Street runs along the approximate line of the Great Roman Road that led north from London Bridge toward the military camps and civilian settlements of the interior, while Cheapside follows a route that connected the Forum to the western approaches to the city. The Church of St. Peter upon Cornhill stands on one of the highest points within the old Roman walls, possibly the site of a temple or important civic building, its elevation still providing commanding views over the surrounding streets, despite the forest of skyscrapers that has grown up around it. The very soil beneath London preserves this layered history in physical form, each generation of builders adding their contributions to an archaeological cake whose ingredients span 2 millennia of continuous human occupation. Victorian basements cut through Georgian foundations that rest on medieval stone that was quarried from Roman buildings that were constructed above prehistoric earthworks, creating a vertical timeline that compresses the entire history of London into 20 feet of stratified deposits. Construction workers excavating new elevator shafts or utility tunnels routinely encounter this buried past, their mechanical diggers bringing to light fragments of Roman pottery, medieval coins, Tudor bricks, and Georgian ceramics in random profusion that speaks to the palimpsest nature of urban landscapes. The financial institutions that have made modern London one of the world's great commercial centres operate from buildings constructed directly above the remains of Roman shops and warehouses, their computerised trading floors occupying the same strategic position beside the Thames that Roman merchants once used for their more modest commercial ventures. The Bank of England stands within the boundaries of the Roman city, as does the Stock Exchange, the insurance markets of Lloyd's, and countless smaller firms whose business depends ultimately on the same advantages of location and communication that first attracted Roman administrators to this Thames crossing nearly 2,000 years ago. Even the climate that shapes daily life in London remains essentially unchanged from Roman times. The same patterns of wind and rain, fog and sunshine that influenced the decisions of imperial urban planners and continue to affect the choices made by modern architects and city planners. The orientation of Roman buildings that sought to maximize winter sunlight and minimize exposure to cold northern winds can still be detected in the alignment of medieval churches and even some modern structures, while the seasonal flooding patterns that prompted Roman engineers to build their port facilities at precisely this elevation continue to influence modern flood, defence schemes and riverside development projects. In this sense, Roman Londinium never truly disappeared, but rather transformed itself into the foundation upon which all subsequent versions of London have been built, its essential character and strategic advantages so compelling that each new civilization to occupy the site has found itself unconsciously recreating many of the same solutions to the same basic problems of urban life. The city that sleeps beneath London is not entirely dead, but continues to live in the patterns of movement, the rhythms of commerce, and the fundamental relationship between human ambition and geographic opportunity that make London what it remains today. As we reach the end of our long journey through these centuries that witnessed the rise, flourishing, and gradual fading of Roman Londinium, perhaps it is fitting to pause and consider what this ancient story might teach us about the nature of human ambition, the fragility of our most cherished accomplishments, and the quiet persistence of memory across the vast expanses of historical time. The tale we have followed together, from the first Roman engineers surveying a muddy Thames crossing to the modern archaeologists carefully brushing soil from 2,000-year-old foundations, offers insights that reach far beyond the particular circumstances of one vanished city, touching instead on questions that every generation must face about the meaning and permanence of their own endeavours. The story of Londinium reminds us, with gentle but unmistakable clarity, that no human institution, however powerful or well-established, can guarantee its own perpetual existence. The merchants who built their prosperous shops along the Roman Forum, the administrators who conducted imperial business in the Great Basilica, the families who made comfortable homes within the protective circuit of the city walls, all of them lived and planned and invested in the future, with the reasonable assumption that the world they knew would endure, if not forever, then at least long enough for their children and grandchildren to inherit and build upon what they had created. Yet within a few centuries the entire framework of Roman civilization in Britain had dissolved, leaving behind only fragments and foundations to hint at what had once seemed so solid and permanent. This recognition of impermanence need not inspire despair or cynical detachment from the projects and communities that give meaning to our own lives. Rather, the example of Londinium suggests a different kind of wisdom, an appreciation for the precious fragility of human achievements that makes them more valuable rather than less, more worthy of our care and attention, precisely because we understand that they cannot endure without constant tending and renewal. The Roman engineers who built London Wall with such skill and durability that sections of it still stand today were not deceived about the ultimate fate of their construction. They knew as well as we do that all human works eventually return to dust, but they built as well as they could anyway, because excellence in craftsmanship and civic responsibility represent values that transcend the particular circumstances of their expression. The gradual rediscovery of Roman London through modern archaeology also offers its own form of consolation and instruction. Even when cities vanish and civilizations collapse, something remains. In the patient stones that resist dissolution, in the patterns of streets and boundaries that guide later development, in the accumulated knowledge and techniques that pass from one generation to another, through channels that may be invisible but prove remarkably durable. The Basilica and Forum of Londinium have long since crumbled into ruin, but the principles of urban planning and civic organization that they embodied have survived in forms adapted to new circumstances, new technologies, and new social arrangements. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Roman Londinium illustrates the profound human capacity for adaptation and renewal in the face of apparently catastrophic change. When the imperial system that had given the city its purpose and prosperity finally withdrew, the site did not remain empty forever, but eventually attracted new communities with different values and different ways of organizing urban life. The London that emerged from the ruins of Londinium was neither a simple restoration of what had been lost, nor a complete break with the past, but something more complex and interesting, a creative synthesis that preserved what remained valuable from earlier traditions, while developing new solutions to the timeless challenges of living together in dense communities beside flowing water. This pattern of continuity within change, of innovation built upon the foundations of previous achievements, suggests that human resilience operates not through the preservation of particular institutions or structures, but through the deeper persistence of the impulses and capabilities that create them in the first place. The specific forms that Roman civilization took in Britain proved vulnerable to the political and economic forces that brought about imperial collapse, but the human desires for security, prosperity, beauty and community that had motivated Roman urban planning survived to inspire new experiments in the centuries that followed. The archaeological recovery of Londinium's buried history offers one final lesson about the relationship between memory and time. For more than a millennium, the achievements of Roman London existed only in fragmentary traditions and folk memories that bore little resemblance to historical reality. Yet the patient work of modern scholars and excavators has gradually restored an increasingly accurate and detailed picture of what daily life was actually like in this vanished community, proving that truth has its own persistence and that careful attention to physical evidence can sometimes recover knowledge that seemed permanently lost. In our own age of rapid change and apparent instability, when the pace of technological and social transformation often makes us feel that we are living through our own version of imperial collapse, the story of Londinium offers both humility and hope. Humility because it reminds us that our own cities and institutions however impressive they may seem to us, participate in the same cycles of growth and decay that have claimed all previous human achievements. Hope, because it demonstrates that human creativity and community building prove remarkably persistent across the centuries, finding new expressions even when familiar forms have been swept away by forces beyond any individual's control. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you might imagine yourself walking through the quiet streets of your own city or town in the early morning hours, when the daily bustle has not yet begun, and you can sense more clearly the layers of history beneath your feet. Consider the generations of people who have walked those same routes before you, each pursuing their own hopes and concerns, each contributing something to the accumulated human presence that makes those places meaningful. Like the merchants of Roman Londinium, we build and plan and care for our communities without knowing what the future will bring, but we do so anyway because the work itself is worthy, because the connections we create with each other and with the places we inhabit represent the most valuable treasures we can leave to those who will follow us into the continuing mystery of time.